This is one of the hardest parts of the Bible. For many people, it's a deal breaker. You read about a God of love, a God who is a father, and then you turn to the Old Testament, to books like Deuteronomy and Joshua, and you read commands that are shocking. Commands to go into a land and wipe out everyone, men, women, and children. It sounds like genocide, and it seems to be commanded by God. So what do we do with that? Do we just ignore it? Do we pretend it's not there? Do we try to defend it? This isn't a small problem. It's a deep, troubling question that sits at the heart of how we understand God, the Bible, and violence. There are no easy bumper sticker answers here. Anyone who gives you one is probably not taking the text or your conscience seriously. So let's just walk through it. Let's look at the different ways people have tried to understand this over the century. We don't have to land on one perfect answer, but we can try to see the problem from a few different angles. First, we have to look at what the text actually says. The main commands are in the book of Deuteronomy. God is speaking to the Israelites, who are on the edge of the promised land, Canaan. He tells them that when they enter the land, they are to completely destroy the people living there. The term used is hirim, which is often translated as the ban, or devoted to destruction. It meant these people and their possessions were to be utterly destroyed as a sort of offering to God. No treaties, no intermarriage, no survivor. In the book of Joshua, we see the Israelites trying to carry this out. The most famous story is the Battle of Jericho. The city is captured, and the Bible says they destroyed everyone in it, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, with the edge of the sword. The only ones saved are Rahab, a prostitute who helped the Israelite spies, and her family. This pattern is repeated with other cities. It's brutal. The text doesn't shy away from it. So why? The Bible itself gives a reason. The primary reason stated is religious purity. God says the Canaanite peoples are engaged in deeply wicked practices. The texts in Leviticus and Deuteronomy list things like idolatry, sacrificing their own children to gods like Molech, cult prostitution, and other detestable acts. God tells the Israelites that if they allow these people to live among them, their corrupting influence will be like a cancer. The Israelites will inevitably start to worship their gods and adopt their practices. And if that happens, the entire project of Israel to be a special people through whom God would bless the entire world would fail before it even started. The argument is that this was a radical, desperate surgery to save the patient. The patient was Israel, and the cancer was the Canaanite religion and culture. This explanation is the most direct one in the text. It frames the conquest not as an ethnic or racial war, but as a divine judgment. God had been patient with the Canaanites for a very long time. In the book of Genesis, God tells Abraham that his descendants will be slaves in Egypt for 400 years, and one of the reasons for the delay in giving them the promised land is because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. This suggests a long period of God waiting, giving them a chance to change, before this final judgment arrived. So the Israelites were not acting on their own behalf, they were acting as God's instrument of judgment against a uniquely and hopelessly corrupt society. This is a powerful argument for some. It puts the conquest in a theological framework. It's not just a land grab. It's a holy war, a one-time historical event to cleanse the land so that God's redemptive plan for humanity could move forward. Without a pure Israel, there is no lineage for the Messiah, no context for Jesus. The stakes were incredibly high. But let's be honest, for most of us this explanation doesn't sit right. Even if we accept that the Canaanite culture was as wicked as described, what about the children? What about the babies? They were not guilty of child sacrifice. They were not engaged in idolatry. How can a just and loving God command the killing of innocent children? This is the point where the divine judgment explanation often breaks down for modern readers. It feels like the punishment doesn't fit the crime, or at least that it's applied to people who didn't commit the crime. It sounds like collective punishment, which goes against our deepest sense of justice. It's hard to reconcile the command to kill a Canaanite baby with the image of Jesus saying, "Let the little children come to me." The two images feel like they come from different universes, from different gods. This deep moral problem has led people to look for other ways to understand these texts. One of the most significant shifts in thinking has come from looking at the context of the ancient world. The Bible wasn't written in a vacuum. It was written in the ancient Near East, a world filled with empires like Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. And when we look at the records left behind by the kings of these empires, we find something interesting. They all use the same kind of language. When an Assyrian king conquered a city, his official inscriptions would boast of total annihilation. He would write about how he left no one alive, how he turned the city to rubble and sowed the ground with salt. It was standard military propaganda. It was a way of saying, we want a total and complete victory. Don't mess with us. It was rhetorical hyperbole and exaggeration meant to glorify the king and terrorize his enemies. It wasn't meant to be a literal journalistic account of every single person who was killed. So some scholars suggest that the language in Joshua should be read in the same way. The command for harem, or total destruction, was a common way of talking about holy war in that culture. The accounts of wiping everyone out might be a stylized, conventional way of saying we want a decisive God-given victory. It might not be a literal description of genocide, and there's actually evidence for this view within the Bible itself. If you read the book of Joshua, it sounds like the conquest was swift and complete. Joshua 11 says, "So Joshua took the whole land, he left no one remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded." It sounds final. But then you get to the book of Judges, which describes the period right after Joshua, and it's a completely different picture. The book of Judges opens by saying that the Israelites failed to drive out the inhabitants of the land. It then lists all the Canaanite peoples who were still living there right alongside the Israelites. The rest of the book is a messy story of Israel coexisting with, fighting against, and being corrupted by these very same peoples they were supposedly commanded to annihilate. So we have a contradiction. Did Joshua wipe everyone out or did he not? If you take the language in Joshua as literal history, the book of Judges makes no sense. But if you take the language in Joshua as ancient military rhetoric, as hyperbolic boasting about a great victory, then it makes perfect sense. The Israelites won some key battles, they established a foothold in the land, and they celebrated this as a total victory given by God, using the standard language of the day. But the reality on the ground was much more complex and drawn out. The Canaanites were still there. This view helps a lot. It suggests that maybe the genocide we read about didn't actually happen, at least not in the way it's described. The commands might have been real, but they were understood and recorded within a specific cultural and literary framework that we don't share. The purpose of the text wasn't to give a precise body count, but to declare that the land belonged to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and that victory was his alone. The archaeology also adds another layer to this. For a long time, people assumed that archaeologists would dig up the cities mentioned in Joshua and find evidence of a massive, violent conquest around the 13th century BCE. But that's not really what they found. Many of the cities that Joshua supposedly destroyed, like Jericho and Ai, show no signs of being destroyed in that time period. Some seem to have already been abandoned for centuries. Other parts of Canaan show a gradual cultural shift rather than evidence of a massive, sudden invasion from an outside group. This doesn't mean the Bible is wrong. It just means that the story of the conquest is probably not a modern history textbook. It's a theological narrative. It's a story told to make a point about God, Israel, and the land. The story consolidates a long, messy process of settlement, migration, and occasional conflict into one epic, divinely led military campaign under a single heroic leader, Joshua. This is a common way for nations to tell their origin stories. Think of the American Revolution. We tell it as a single unified story, but the reality was much more complicated. So, combining these two ideas, the idea of ancient military hyperbole, and the idea that the conquest wasn't a single historical event, gives us a way to read these texts without believing that God commanded a literal, historical genocide. The command was to be completely loyal to God, to utterly reject the Canaanite gods and their practices. This theological command was then expressed in the language of total warfare, the only language that made sense for that kind of absolute claim in that time and place. But even with this perspective, there's still a problem. The commands are still in the Bible. The violent language is still there, attributed to God. Even if it was hyperbole, it's a very violent kind of hyperbole. It still presents a picture of God that is deeply troubling. How do we square that with the God we see in Jesus? This leads to another important idea, progressive revelation. This is the idea that God didn't reveal everything about himself all at once. He revealed his character and his will gradually over time, in ways that people could understand within their own cultures. Think of it like teaching a child. You don't start with calculus. You start with 1 plus 2. You speak in simple terms. As the child matures, you can introduce more complex and nuanced ideas. In the ancient world, life was brutal. The concept of a god was tied to power, to victory in battle. The gods of the nations were warrior gods. For the Israelites, a small, weak, newly freed group of slaves, to believe that their God was real, they needed to believe he was stronger than the gods of Canaan. They needed to believe he could fight for them. So God met them where they were. He spoke to them in the language they understood, the language of kings and conquests and holy war. The primary lesson was not genocide is good. The primary lesson was Yahweh is the one true God, and you must be loyal to him alone. In that Bronze Age context, that lesson was communicated in the familiar terms of total war against the supporters of other gods. But that wasn't God's final word. As Israel's story unfolds through the Old Testament, the prophets begin to introduce a more radical vision. They start talking about a God who desires mercy, not sacrifice, a God who cares about justice for the poor and the oppressed, not just ritual purity. There's a trajectory, a movement toward a deeper understanding of God's character. And that trajectory finds its ultimate destination in Jesus. When Jesus arrives, he completely upends the old way of thinking. He says, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." This is a revolution. He takes the concept of the enemy, the very people who, in Joshua's day, were to be devoted to destruction, and says they are to be the objects of love and prayer. For Christians, Jesus is the perfect and complete revelation of who God is. The book of Hebrews says he is the exact imprint of God's nature. So if we want to know what God is truly like, we look at Jesus. And Jesus shows us a God who heals the sick, eats with outcasts, forgives sinners, and ultimately absorbs violence rather than inflicting it. He dies on a cross, forgiving his executioners. So when we look back at the Canaanite conquest from this side of the cross, we have to read it through the lens of Jesus. Jesus becomes the key that helps us understand the whole story. What this means is that the commands in Joshua cannot be God's final or ultimate will. They were a temporary, culturally bound expression of God's will for a specific people in a specific time. But in Jesus, God has revealed a more excellent way. The enemies we are now called to conquer are not people made of flesh and blood. As the Apostle Paul wrote, "Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil." The conquest, then, can be reread as a physical picture of a spiritual reality. The land of Canaan becomes a symbol of the human heart. The Canaanites, with their idolatry and wickedness, become symbols of the sin that occupies our hearts. The command to utterly destroy them is a command to be ruthless with our own sin. We are to show no mercy to the greed, the pride, the lust, the selfishness in our own lives. We are to devote them to destruction and allow God to take complete possession of our hearts. In this reading, the violence is reinterpreted. It's not a blueprint for how to treat other people, but a powerful, if shocking, metaphor for the spiritual battle within each of us. So where does this leave us? We have a few different pieces of the puzzle. We have the text's own justification, a unique divine judgment on a profoundly wicked culture to protect Israel's spiritual future. This is the simplest reading, but it creates a huge moral problem with the death of innocents. Then we have the historical and cultural context. The language of total destruction was common military hyperbole in the ancient world, and the biblical and archaeological evidence suggests the conquest was not the single, sweeping event described in Joshua. This helped solve the historical problem, suggesting a literal genocide didn't happen as described. And finally, we have a theological lens of Jesus' progressive revelation. Shows God meeting people where they were. But Jesus reveals God's true heart, which is love for enemies, not their destruction. This allows us to see the conquest as part of an older, incomplete understanding of God that is fulfilled and corrected by Christ. We can also see it as a spiritual metaphor for the war against sin in our own lives. No single one of these answers is likely to be completely satisfying on its own. They all have strengths and weaknesses. Perhaps the most honest approach is to hold them together in tension. Maybe the story functions on multiple levels. It reflects the brutal reality of the ancient world. It uses the language of that world to make a profound theological point about loyalty to God. And it ultimately serves as a shadow, a prefigurement of a deeper spiritual battle that is won not by the sword, but by the self-sacrificial love of the cross. What we cannot do is use these texts as a justification for violence today. Now, that would be a complete misreading of the entire biblical story, which clearly moves away from this kind of holy war and toward a kingdom built on peace and enemy love. These texts in Joshua are descriptive of a unique moment in Israel's salvation history. They are not prescriptive for us. They describe what was, not what should always be. In the end, it remains a dark and difficult corner of the Bible. It forces us to wrestle with the nature of God, the complexity of Scripture, and the vast cultural gap between our world and the ancient world. It reminds us that faith is not about having all the easy answers. Sometimes it's about trusting in the character of God revealed in Jesus, even when we can't fully understand or explain everything we read in the texts that have been passed down to us. It's okay to say, this is horrifying. I don't understand it. It's okay to sit with the tension. That honesty is probably a much better place to be than a place of cheap and easy explanations that sanitize the violence and ignore the very real pain these passages can cause. The God of the Bible is big enough to handle our questions, our doubts, and even our outrage. And the story doesn't end in Joshua. It ends with a resurrected Jesus and a promise of a new creation where violence is no more. That's the ultimate context for reading everything that comes before.